Hello everyone and welcome to the NSTA Web Seminar Series, Live Interactive Learning at Your Desktop. My name is Robert Payo, joining you from Denver, Colorado. I will be your moderator for today's session. Also joining us from NSTA is Jeff Lehman. Jeff will be here to answer any technical questions you have during the session. In tonight's session, Questions, Claims, and Evidence, the important place of argument in science writing, we'll learn strategies that allow students to explore their own questions and develop and also deepen their understanding of science concepts. Joining us today are our esteemed presenters. Let me just advance it over here. Jay Staker, Iowa State University, Lori Norton Meier, University of Louisville, and Brian Hand, University of Iowa. We're very glad to have you here. And as I had mentioned, the NSTA Learning Center will post the session, and you'll be able to see it on NSTA Learning Center nsta.org in just a few weeks. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Jay, who's going to start us off. Jay, welcome, and thank you so much. I'm anxious to learn along with everybody else, so go ahead.
Thank you, Robert, for the introduction and the tour through the platform. And welcome all of you tonight, and thank you for joining us for the conversation around questions, claims, and evidence and argument-based inquiry. The faces you see on the screen, we've been working at this for years, and Lori and Brian and I were all at Iowa State University at one time, but I'm not sure what it says that they both left and I'm still there. But as we move forward through the evening with the idea of questions, claims, and evidence and the science writing and the argument with claims and evidence in the classroom, the context for the webinar tonight is this is a follow-up from regional workshops. Brian, Lori, and a fellow presenter who couldn't be with us tonight, Lynn Hogue, did a session in Louisville, and then Lynn Hogue and I did one also in Atlanta at the regional NSTA conferences. So those were the basis for the webinar tonight. But I'd just be curious, before we jump in, of the people who were there, if you could give me an indication maybe with a thumbs up or some emoticon on the attendee list, whether you were at one of the regionals. That could help us as we move forward.
So if you remember where the emoticon is, it's that first smiley face button, and you just hover over it, and you give your thumbs up or thumbs down if you were attending. Not so much in disapproving, but, you know, yes and no.
Yeah, that works for me. So it looks like, quick glance from the ones that have indicated, this is all new to you. So that will maybe change how we approach this through the evening. So thank you for that information. So what we would like to do is explore the idea around learning and how argument plays into that, and then practice some of the work here tonight. And we're very learner-centered in our approach, and both in working with youth in the classroom, but also with how we do professional development. So it's going to be a challenge for us because we're very conversational, very interactive. And the platform will push us to beyond our typical comfort zone. So it'll be a fun ride, I think. And the in our practice tonight, we'll be looking at maybe just some chemistry or physics examples, but content really is what we're thinking about as much. It's really the practice of argumentation. So we're not going to get hung up on content, but we will examine how this fits into standards and maybe talk about how you can get started implementing these kind of things in your classroom. So that's kind of the beginning. Lori, I'm going to give you a chance if you want to chime in to your frame from where you come from, too, because you do bring a unique voice to this conversation.
Certainly. So how I got to start working with Jay and Brian is that I am a literacy educator, and I am really interested in language practices. And so Brian came into my office one day and said, I hear you're interested in the intersection between inquiry and language. Would you be interested in working with me? And that was approximately 10 years ago. And so kind of the lens I bring to this tonight is I come at it not particularly from a science education standpoint, although I study in science classrooms and how language develops, albeit why I'm very interested in questions, claims, and evidence, and how talk and dialogue help children to explore what they know, what they don't know, and then how they use that talk to, in a variety of ways, in writing, in explaining and going public with what they know, in creating. We've been doing a lot of work on multimodal representations and seeing the variety of ways that children show us with creations, whether that be web-based, whether that be traditional marks on a page, but thinking about how they show us what they know. So that's a little different lens, but Brian and Jay still allow me to stay around and explore new questions with them. So that's the lens I'll bring tonight.
Thanks, Lori. And Lori and I are trying to explore, I have 7 grandchildren under 7 years of age, so that's my focus right now. So we're looking at, even preschool and how to bring argumentation and science into that level. If you look at the next generation science standards, which aren't out yet, but if you look at the things from the framework and some of the drafts that have been out, you'll see language like what you see on the screen here for scientific and engineering practices. And as you take a quick look at those, what we are talking about is very evident and prominent in this next look at standards as we move forward across the country. And so the idea of questions, developing using models, Lori talked about the multimodal, how we represent information, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, different kinds of language, mathematical language or computational thinking, different ways to represent our understanding, constructing explanations, taking data and turning into claims and evidence, designing solutions in engineering, using got myself in the corner. I had my image over my language. Engaging in argument from evidence and obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. If you look at these standards, they're very important in the work that we do. And so we were very excited to see these things show up in the conversation from both the framework and from the next round of standards. I'm not sure if it's going to look the same when it comes out, but at least it's being discussed. So when we think about science, we could probably spend the rest of the night just haggling over definition of science, but science is about the advancement it's about a process. It's a construction process and a critique process. I think in Michael Ford's work, the two roles in science is the constructor and the critiquer. And that idea of building our own understanding and then critiquing others to help them sharpen it or helping them see holes in their reasoning, that's the foundation of what we do. So scientists negotiate with each other. They negotiate both privately and publicly. They have to make their own sense inside their own head and with their colleagues in their own labs, but then they have to negotiate with their wider community. And that's the idea of claims and evidence. They have to put their ideas out there and defend them. And in that defense, the rest of the community works to sharpen or support. And that's that community sense of the construction in science. And scientists don't use information transfer to move the body of knowledge forward. And, I taught for 25 years a long time ago. And in the process, as I came through my undergraduate work and my graduate work, a lot of the information was transfer of information, lecture, note-taking, and then we were to make sense of that on our own and be able to put it back onto a test. But we're trying to move past that in the work that we do, and I think you look across the country, and that's the whole conversation is how do we move past that and in the old language of inquiry, now it's about process, but the idea of helping students build their own understanding in a hands-on environment where they can do their own testing and have to build their own information and put that out there and defend it publicly. So we try to mimic what happens in the science lab. And one of the things we always talk about, if it was information transfer, who gave the first scientist his information and where's the answer book or the answer key to knowledge in science? It just doesn't work that way, and I think we all understand that. And it's a bit of a absurd way to look at it, but in science education, we often have students that come in and their drive is to get the right answer as opposed to understand the process. And we're very process oriented. And so we're not about information transfer. So that brings us to our first poll. And so I think I turn it to you, Robert.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is set the poll to open up. Oh, what happened here? So bear with me for a second here. I got to push the button that says make it visible. There we go. All right. So what do you think is the one tool that all scientists use in their work with each other? A, technology, B, language, C, math, D, computers. And for those that aren't sure what to do, look up above the participant box. You'll see a letter A, the fourth tab there, fourth box there, and select your answer there. I'll give you a couple more seconds to respond. Although it looks like we're having a consensus in terms of language going on here. So I will pass it over to you, Jay, and see what you think about that.
Yeah, it would have been interesting if we didn't have to give the prompts and could have just had open-ended discussion. If we asked that question cold, I'm curious how many of you would have answered language. And I know typically we'll get things like, well, it's their brain or it's their lab equipment. Language doesn't usually come up first. But it's just a fun way to start thinking about that the most important thing in science is language. And we often run into, at my level when I was in high school science, well, I don't teach literacy, or I don't teach reading, I don't teach writing, I don't teach those things. Well, everything we had to do was language-based. So it really is a foundation of the argument of combining literacy and the science. And I'm going to turn this to Lori to talk a little bit about this because this is her backyard.
Sure, I'd like to share a little example with you. So one of the things Jay and Brian and I do, we typically have 3-year research studies where we study teachers putting argument-based inquiry into their classrooms and then the impact that has on student learning. So I have a great little example from a 4th grade and a 10th grade that just happened in the last week where 10th grade biology students were writing their final summary of a unit they were working on. And as part of the approach that we use, we ask kids to write to a real audience. So not just for the teacher, but to always have a real audience that they can engage in those practices of Michael Ford's comprehending and critiquing. So they wrote their papers and sent them to 4th grade. And the 4th graders critiqued those papers and sent them back. And it was quite exciting to be there when the 4th graders were on their way out the door saying, they have some pretty good thinking, but to really do the level of good science, they need to put more words into what they're thinking. And so it was just how kids were already seeing that science is about using language, and it's about I guess the word is manipulating and thinking about how we put words together to convey our thinking to an audience. Then we had this week where it went back to the 10th graders who said, wow, I had no idea, my thinking wasn't that clear. I didn't know 4th graders could comprehend at that level. I need to take my writing to a whole different level and think about this in different ways. So I think just what we saw play out with those classrooms where they had real audiences and the real opportunity to critique, they were engaging in the language of science. they had that opportunity to engage it the way scientists do, to get excited about it, and to think about how we use words to explain and to make sense, and then how we communicate to someone else. That gets kicked back to us to revise our thinking and to think about how we could revise what we're saying to make it more clear. So I think it's such an important thing to see. We not only use language to communicate, but we use it to make sense of our world. That language is not only communicating, it's also our thinking tool.
And Lori, when you say language, could you unpack that a little bit about from your world, what would that all include?
Sure, this language in the broadest sense. So, you know, one of the things we even talk about is that thinking differently now about text. You know, as we talk about 21st century literacies, text is not just marks on the page. A person can be a text. A statue can be a text. A piece of art can be a text. And so we think in different ways about text as well. So that's language as in what you can see, what you hear, all the way from reading, writing, talking, listening, and then we use the term viewing and responding. So we're thinking about language in the broadest sense.
Thank you. And so just keep that in mind as we move forward whenever you hear language. It is a very broad view that we take. It's time to put you to work now. I'd like you to jump into the chat box, and I'd like you to just give a definition of teaching and a definition of learning. And just take a couple, maybe a minute or two to type those in. And as soon as you get done typing, you start following along and read what people have written. So please just jump in there and type in your definitions. And I'd encourage you not to overthink it.
Carrie, you're in the chat box right there when you type in the chat. So, yeah. So just type where you were, and your responses will come out. Problem, Carrie. Jay, it looks like we've got some responses coming in there. So I'll leave it to you to kind of look at those whenever you're ready. So.
Yeah, I see the learning now is coming out. Now, there's a wide range of things there, but there's some commonalities as you're typing those away. I want to jump on one there. That idea of engaging students in a topic. And Carrie, thank you for that. I'm picking on Carrie because it's right in the middle of my screen right now, so I can read that one. When we think about what we consider to be teaching, what we consider to be learning, it's a question we maybe don't spend enough time thinking about, but I want to start with the learning one because that's really the most important, because if there's no learning, what value is teaching? And if we think about learning, I saw one in there was, I'm going to scroll up here and see if I can manage to control this and think at the same time. The idea that Carrie had engaging students, Lori had making, or Kathy had sense making, and incorporating new knowledge, metacognitive skills, awareness, that sense making or making meaning, building understanding, that shows up regularly through there. And I want to encourage us to really think about how does that happen. And so when you experience learning as a learner, you yourself, tonight, as Lori and I are putting information out there, what are you doing with it to make sense of that? And please, I'd encourage you to continue that conversation in the chat box. So if I would say that the sky is green, I'm giving you some information, I'm giving you something to deal with. How do you process that? What do you do with that? How do you make sense? How do you engage with that information? So we see Kathy's taking notes. Others of you, I think, are constantly we're bombarded by information, and some we discount, some we engage with, and then if we think about it from a cognitive perspective, we can start bringing the words like schema and concepts and conceptual frameworks and thinking about all that from the theoretical side. What we really have to do is decide whether we're going to engage with a new bit of information or reject it. And if we engage with it, we really have to decide what we're going to do with it. And it's where we try to fit it into what we already have inside our brains and see how it connects, we make those connections. And I hope that really captures what you're talking about when you say, making meaning or making sense of or engaging. That's how we really think about that. And the language we use around it is, we say learning is negotiation, and which would make sense because that's kind of what our whole world's about. But what we mean by that is you have to negotiate with everything you experience during the day. You have paradigms that filter out, especially at our age. As adults, we filter out so much information that comes our way, we don't even deal with it. It doesn't fit our paradigm, we reject it. Those pieces of information that come our way that we choose to deal with, we then either fit it into our meaning, it already fits, great, it lines up, or what if it doesn't line up? Then we have to make a decision. Is it right? Do what we think is right? We have to do that in negotiation. It's a dance around that information. And one of the fun things that we always play with in our world is language really matters. And I saw the word facilitate, and I wish Brian was here because that's one of his pet points to bring out is, thinking back to your Ed Psych class, we incorporate new information into our schema when we reach that stage of disequilibrium or perturbation, or we can throw all those words out there, but it's when what we have doesn't work anymore and we have to make an adjustment, or we reject or modify what our schema is. And if we're facilitating, think of that facile, ease. If we're easing the way, then we often block that sense of frustration or disequilibrium. So we really pound on that. We really make the students to get where they're really frustrated and have to decide whether they're going to reject or move on. So if learning is negotiation, teaching should be about negotiation. And we think of teaching as dealing at the conceptual level and the big ideas, not the factoids. Those are the ornamentations that come along later, but we try to build from the concept first, from the big idea, and then create a lot of space for learners to engage with information, experiences, to make connections. And so when you think about planning lessons, as your students come to the door, we check for the prior knowledge, and when we do that, we're assessing where the students already are, so we know how to take to the next step. Well, we're knowing what we can connect to, what's in their framework already. And so the role then as teacher is to give them space and experience to negotiate with around the content. Your job as teachers is to control the curriculum, right? That's your job. And to do that, you have to manage the learning experiences and the space and all the safety issues around this. But it's really the learner that has to negotiate with the information. And that, one of the things that we think about, who controls learning? And I'll see, anybody want to take a jump in the chat box to answer that. Now, who controls learning? And I'll watch for that. Lori, do you want to add anything? I've been rambling.
No, I think that's good. That's just the question I was asking there is then if we as teachers control the curriculum, then leading the same way as to who controls learning. And I see Carrie has put the student controls learning. A teacher that we work with often says, I can't control learning, but what I can do is I can orchestrate opportunities. and I've always opportunities for learning. And so also that recognition that she controls all of those things that Jay, what he just mentioned, is that we can control the environment, we can control the materials kids will have, we can control that structure. We can't make the pieces come together for them.
And Adam, as you listen to that, or I'm sorry, Alan. Alan had in there student-teacher interaction controls learning. Does Lori's description resonate with what you were saying there? And you know, as I pause here, you'll hear some silence as I read the chat and process it, and I'd encourage you to follow along that as well. And with the idea that permanent change in behavior or potential or capability, you know, that's that we've changed what's inside our head, and that control, you know, we argue is 100% of what happens inside our heads is controlled only by us. But as teachers, your job is to control the environment and the learning experiences based on your curriculum, your students, and try to engage them into those experiences. Well, since we don't have, the question from Louisville, we don't have a lot of you that experienced that, since I don't think anybody was in Louisville for the workshop. When you hear the word argument and you hear the word explanation, what do you think of? Especially with argument. Let's start with that one. When you hear argument, what's that mean to you? And I'll give you a moment to, as you type that we have colleagues around the globe working on the same process. We've got a lot of work going in South Korea. There's some going in Finland, Australia, Canada, some in South America, I think Taiwan. But in Turkey, the idea of argument there, they had some cultural issues, so they were very careful about how they framed that language, because it had a much more aggressive definition to it. But confrontation, not conflict, and questioning, disagreement. We switched away from this word a little bit with teachers we worked with in the elementary level because of the baggage the word brought into the discussion. So we spend a lot of time more talking about negotiations and argument. But the language you use, argument's more from the rhetorical or the rhetoric, that it's engagement over claims and evidence and challenging. Lori, I'll turn to you for the definition of argument.
Excuse me, I started sneezing. Must be allergy season, so I apologize. Argument, we see some interesting things flowing in here. So Margot mentions that argument is a discussion with evidence. Amin mentions that an explanation is not an argument, whereas an argument is a series of statements designed to support or establish the truth of an idea, an explanation. Right? So interesting to think about how we do this very same process that you're doing, whether my work has lately been with kindergarten through 2nd grade on the development of argument in young children. And we do this thing from the very beginning, is to start with kids in the very first weeks of school and talk about what does it mean to argue, and try to get them to talk about that. And then we put the words up on the wall, we argue ideas, not people. So we move from this idea of an argument that might happen on the playground to how scientists argue to push ideas forward. And then we stick to those kind of rules and have a lot of different variety, whether I'm working with kindergartners or 8th graders, about what it means to argue ideas, as Jay was talking about, and not people.
And so in our slide here, this is from work from Douglas Walton at the University of Toronto, and it matches very closely to what you already put out there, so I won't spend much time on it. But we like to play in the argument world. Explanation has its place, but the idea of thinking of explaining, I actually like the way it was said better in the chat than what we have here. And so as we look at that, some very good explanation there, but a discursive description of fact or idea. So it's really that idea of explaining to others what already is known. An argument is about about unknown, pushing the envelope and helping build our understanding and feeding that off of others and see where the consensus may lie in that process. So our goal tonight will be to focus around the idea of argument, not so much explanation. But do bear in mind they both have their place. And so when we talk about argument, we're talking about a process that's made up of questions, claims, and evidence. And the question is what is the centering point for the argument. And then claims and evidence. Claim is your, basically, in a very reductionist version, your answer to your question, and evidence is the reasoning behind that. A story that convinces others or unfolds your reasoning to others so they can come to the same conclusion or see the flaws in yours. And so when we think about claim and evidence, what is a claim? And a claim would be, as I said in our reductionist, very simple language, the answer to our question, and the evidence is the story we built to deal with that. One thing we always run into as we move into a classroom and start to do argument is the challenge to transition between data and evidence. And when I first started using this in my classroom, I would have students for their evidence put, see the data. And I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, well, the data speaks for itself. And being from Iowa, it makes me cringe to say this, but if you think about elections, because we had our share of election information over the past 4 years, but if you think about elections, if the data spoke for itself, we would all vote the same, I think, because we'd all have the same data and access to that same data. The arguments around climate change, the arguments around any kind of set of data, really, I think if you step back and look at the controversial ones, it's easy to see that evidence and data are not the same. And when students in a classroom build a set of data, they have to take that data and make sense of it. And we're going to play with that here in just a bit. But we would encourage you to build a culture of claims and evidence in your classroom. And always use the words claims and evidence in dialogue. So as you are engaging with students, I'll give an example where I was in a classroom. It was a fifth grade classroom. And the teacher was talking about a Valentine's Day party. And he said something to the fact, I was in there and actually had to luck out and be there that day. He goes, well, I know this is really something that it's really just for girls. The boys don't really care about that. And one of the students said, well, you just made a claim. What's your evidence for that claim? And it opened up an incredible dialogue, and they backed him into a corner on his comment because he didn't have any evidence. He was just making a claim. And he built that culture where his students would push back, so he just couldn't just spew information out there. They really had a challenging and that scientific cynicism built into their thinking. And they actually the same group of students went to the school board and made claims and evidence to the school board about some policy changes they wanted made, and were able to take what they were using in science as process and use it in a radically different fashion. And I know, Lori, I'm gonna bring you in again to think about this with the little ones and some of the examples you have from that.
Certainly. We use claim and evidence, again, when we read a story to the kids. We start to use that in our before reading, during reading, after reading. Make a claim. What do you think this book will be about? Where will we find our evidence? And then when we finish reading the book, did our claim hold up? Did we have good evidence? We also use it, kids come in and say, I watched a really good movie last night, or I saw a really good TV show. So that's your claim. What's your evidence? So it really becomes embedded in their ways of thinking, And you think no matter what grade level you teach, claims and evidence can be, can permeate our lives. And it really helps us as well with, as we work to next generation science standards, it also works with the new Common Core academic standards we have in English language arts. Strong argument, evidence-based writing necessary in the English language arts. So the more we can build this idea of asking a question, making a claim, and backing it up with evidence is a pattern that helps kids. So the more that you can embed that in your talk patterns in the classroom, the more that it'll become a way of life and a way of talking with the kids. We often even have parents who will come to say, we can't even have dinner conversation without being questioned about, are you making a claim, Mom? So it really does begin to permeate their lives, and they begin to see it in other places.
And I also want to draw your attention to, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but Amin has some eloquent language around argument, explanation, and claims and evidence in the chat box. And there's a whole, it's not as common as it used to be that I don't think, but rhetoric used to be a course that many people had to take in college, where they would have to understand how to build argument and use the whole process of logic and the idea of deduction, induction, that whole process. But I think it's often lost today. So, but obviously not totally lost. That was encouraging to see that. But our goal is to help you shift the way your students talk, because the way they talk reflects what's going inside their head, and we get them to make public that internal or personal negotiation. So we're going to play with this for just a little bit here. I don't know how this is going to work, but we'll give it a shot. We're going to do an exercise that comes out of the book that I think we use it both in questions, claims, and evidence, and also negotiating science. But it's Mr. Xavier, a claims and evidence exercise. This was developed by a grad student at Iowa State, chemistry grad student, to help kids understand how to make claims and evidence. So I'm going to give you a mystery on the next slide, short mystery, and I'm going to have you read that. And as you read it, I want you to think about all the data or observations in the story. And just make a mental note of, well, that's data, that's data, that's data. And then after you finish the story, step back and reflect from what prior knowledge is popping into my thought process, and where did that come from? So as you have, as you're making sense of this, you're going to have prior knowledge come to bear, and think about, ooh, where did that come from? And then review all the data points with your prior knowledge, and think about, well, I'm going to use this one, this one, this one, and think of the ones you'd exclude or not use. Then make a claim. And I don't know how much time we'd have to actually type it out, but just quick, brief claim evidence in the chat box over there. And watch other people. And I think you might find it interesting to see the variation of how this comes out. And the idea is you look at these, think about, wow, why is theirs different? Or what did they include? What did I include? What did they omit? And how did we come to the decision we made of how to use that data? And so I'm going to go to the next slide. And here we go. And I think, you have your pen. If you'd like to, feel free to mark that up so other people see what you're thinking. I've never tried this before, so it's a learning experience. Makes me wonder, is a webinar like radio, no dead air? But I'm going to be quiet. Well, hopefully we've all got it read by now and are in the process. But if we just take a quick look through this story. So we can actually start, there is data that you're working with a partner, you're private detectives, you're not the police, you were hired, you don't know by who, there was a death, so Xavier's dead, gender is male, he's rich, reclusive, anxious, startled easily, paranoia. He had servants that he fired, even when they'd been there a long time. Same meal every night. Rare baked potato sour cream. There was a terrible storm. He had his usual dinner. He's still dead. And we can go down through the whole story. As you think about that, we now we're getting some claims in there. Poisons from eating rare steak. The wine is a red stain. Can't explain the window. So he was poisoned. There's one. High cholesterol. So we can take that and say, okay, so far we've got, and I think we can stop there because that gives us a sense of it. We have two different claims. And if we look at those claims, I'm not as young as I used to be. I have high cholesterol. I have a family history of heart disease. That's all prior knowledge. And so the information up here, that might be very significant to me in how I interpret this data. And the evidence I would build from that, I might see that very differently than someone who read a lot of mystery novels and would interpret this from a Agatha Christie point of view. And as I look in the chat, that you start to even interpret even farther, so it engages the imagination. But the data we bring to the story is also part of the evidence that we build and helps us interpret the idea of bias and what that means. So it helps everybody understand that they bring things to the table, and it's good to get those out there so you understand your own bias and how that influences how you interpret what you see. And that's really the value, as we saw in earlier discussions, of the social nature of all this process. So a claim, we had a claim that he was startled by the broken window, and I'm going to make an assumption here that when he was startled, he had a heart attack and keeled over and spilled the wine and so on. So that would be a fun way to engage in the idea of claims and evidence, but get thinking about building that structure that supports what claim you make. He choked on that one steak, he ate it whole.
Okay, looks like, okay, here we go.
Laura, why don't you, if you have anything to add there, as we review this, any additions?
No, the conversation is great.
So let's think about what just was going on inside your head. From our discussion earlier, were you putting forth an argument or an explanation? And I think we saw in the chat box a little bit of both going on. But mostly there was the formation or the beginnings of argument. And the next question I think is critical. Is the knowledge you're constructing correct? How would you answer that? It's an intriguing question, but I might argue that it's the wrong question. But it's the reason we put that in there. Is it correct? That's the way we tend to think about, and that's the way our kids tend to think about the information they come up with. We like to think in settled terms, not the unsettled. And scientists on their, in their argument process, they're searching for explanation, and I think they're intrigued by the unsettled. So instead of thinking about, is the knowledge you're constructing correct, is it satisfactory? Is it, does it help move the discussion forward? And it's very intriguing. As you read that story, if you're like everybody else who reads that story, a lot of them want to first get the coroner's report. They want more information. They want more data, just like science does. And they want, we're always trying to break through that next level of technology to get more data. And the whole buzz around the Higgs boson and the search for the particle, that's that drive that makes things happen. And as you went through the story, were you trying to persuade or explain? And if we were sitting in a circle, you can get some pretty heated discussions going back and forth. You're really not trying to explain. You're trying to persuade others, and that's that idea of claims and evidence. Anything else, Laurie, before I go on?
Sure. Just to share, this is kind of a gruesome story to use with young children. So we have some creations that our teachers have made, like off the idea, who stole the cookies from the cookie jar, and some of those ideas for them to be able to go and think about gathering evidence and making a claim and thinking about that. So the murder mystery was a little gruesome for some of our K through 2 teachers, so they came up with a few other types of like the who stole the cookies from the cookie jar.
Are you making a claim that it was a murder?
Excuse me.
Oh, you just missed some eloquent things. I was talking with the mic off. I apologize. As you look at this slide, this is a summary of what we just talked about. I want to jump to the last two pieces here, the coherence between the components. I like to think of it as a tight argument. The pieces fit together, and you can see the connections from the question, claim, and evidence. And then to build claims and evidence, that's where the students are required to do their reasoning. And in the research projects around the SWH, or the argument-based inquiry that we've been working with, using the literacy components, we're seeing good growth in the Cornell critical thinking test. That's the metric we're using right now. We have treatment and control schools, and seeing significant growth across that. So it's been pretty stable over several years to see that kind of growth. Now let's look at you as learners as you went through that story, or what you're doing right now with what we're putting in front of you. What were you doing cognitively as you developed claims and evidence? And when you made your claims and evidence, you were doing it in isolation, especially in this circumstance. Who were you negotiating with in that first round? And you think about that when you're negotiating with yourself. What's that look like? I know my self-negotiation is often out loud and quite heated. But we all go through that in different ways, but we do negotiate with ourselves. And Laurie, could you take a moment here and talk about the idea of negotiating with, from the literacy side, negotiating with text and those perspectives?
Sure. First, Jay, I see that Carrie is asking this question about hypothesis, and we kind of deal with that question a lot. I'm going to throw it back to you for talking about the science side, but in language, a lot of our teachers come up with the standardized test that the students have to take. We'll use the term hypothesis. So we do need to have that vocabulary discussion But I'll throw it back to Jay for the claims, evidence, hypothesis, and then I can talk about the.
That's interesting because we often avoid that word because it's one of those things that if you would stand our template up against the traditional lab format that I experienced as a student and used as a teacher as well, where you'd start out with your questions, you'd have your hypothesis, and then do your tests, and then work your way down to your conclusions. It's a word that we basically avoid, not because the process is bad, but we use different language around it. So we start with the beginning ideas, and before we design tests, what do we think is going to happen? How are we going to answer our question? And so that hypothesizing component of what are our beginning ideas really comes out in the beginning of this process. But we really try to come at it very cyclically, if that's a word. If we start with what the students already know and they generate questions they're interested around, as we look at some examples, maybe in a later time it'll be clear. But in that process, their beginning ideas and the questions they develop, if we take time and say, well, what do you think is going to happen there? And it gives them an open-ended chance to really start to explore what they already know. And then as a teacher, it gives you a chance then to assess what they know and how to process that information. But that's very similar to what a hypothesis might be. We just don't formalize it in the same way. And I hope that is helpful. Lori, would you add anything to that?
No, I just think as many of our teachers have found, they need to have that very discussion so that if the standardized test your students are taking uses that term hypothesis, you don't want that to be the first place they hear it. And in an argument-based inquiry classroom that's so embedded in language, kids get fascinated with words and how we label things, and one of the things we do a lot with teachers is to create concept maps and to think about the linking and relationship words. So it's very good for kids to think about why don't we use the word hypothesis and what's meant when someone uses that in that very same way. So the other thing is Jay asked about using language in learning. In the world of linguistics and language theorists, Michael Halliday and many of his partners in research talk about kind of 3 stages of language and learning as perceive, ideate, and present. And we see through argument-based inquiry, students are able to engage in all of those levels. So they perceive there's a question, they perceive there's a problem, and they write about it. They write to be able to figure out, they talk about it, perceive what the problem is, what would be a good question here, what do we know. Ideate is when we write to think, right? There are numerous ones of us who, you write and you write your way into an answer and think, wow, I had to do all of that writing to get to this understanding. In many of science content area literacy courses, they talk about that as writing to learn. But that often in linguistic and language circles, we call that ideate. And I like to use that one a lot when I have something due. It's all right, I'm ideating on it. And ideate is the word to be able to think about how I have a question, I know what the problem is, now how am I going to work my way through that? And then the final is to present. And too many times we think of presentation as just the summary writing, but we often see it in presentation, we understand what we don't know, or we get audience feedback that helps us negotiate new understandings and to think of what that next question is. So when we're thinking about how language impacts learning, always kind of think about where's the perceiving, where's the ideate, and where's the presenting. Okay?
And I was thinking, with the lateness of the day, maybe we're not ideating, maybe we're ID4ing or ID2ing. That's as good as it gets, folks. That's as funny as it gets, so I apologize. I'm not going to talk about this, the first point. It does reflect the fact that we're doing this around the world, but when we shift our focus to learning, that idea, we start where the students are at and not where we think they are, and that said, if you go back to the idea of, surfacing what the kids already understand and using, your common strategies for, identifying beginning ideas or prior knowledge, that gives us a good assessment of where to start. And we like to think about three-dimensional planning. So if you plan the whole learning landscape, as you go back to your classroom, you have your concepts that you're going to be teaching. If you think about, and we encourage people to do their own concept map and put down what they know, and then you start to populate your concept map, not only with the ideas, the concepts, and the facts that go around that. What learning experiences do I have that fit in, and where do they fit? And we've even started talking about the idea of meta ideas, the ideas above the big ideas. And for those of you in the elementary, this is probably a more familiar concept because you're going back and forth between social studies, language, science, whatever else, your mathematics you have to focus on today. If you think about that, a lot of the big ideas that we deal with in science, for instance, systems. If I have students that come in and I'm trying to teach them about the solar system and they have no concept, nothing to link that to, maybe we start with systems that they are familiar with, such as an ecosystem. In Iowa, it might be the food chain in the barnyard. In the barn, we've got the cat, the mouse, the hawk, the corn. We can start to build that relationship. Well, this is a system that works together, and then that can transfer right over to social studies with westward expansion and why did the systems build up the way they did. So you can start thinking in a sense of economy, where the idea of argument can often take a lot of time, but if we're building an economy of concepts that reach across many ideas, that gives us some economy to recover that. And one of the things that we are very learner-centered, but we throw you into that same mix is if learning is about negotiation, that means you have to negotiate. And it's a common experience with teachers that, it's a little disconcerting when they get started, but once they start negotiating with their students, they find out that they talk less, the students talk more. And if science is about language and learning is about negotiation, that means you're going to have the students using a lot of language and they're going to have to be negotiating. And I did mention early on that sense of space, and that means space both physically and temporally. They have to have that time to engage with those ideas. So if you think about that, how could I teach a science lesson with no language? It just won't work. And so we have to really engage around that sense of language. And talking, reading, and writing is at the core of all that. So time for another poll. When you think about working with your students, what are the ways you have them represent information? And Lori, talked about that early in the presentation, but take a moment and think about, which of these you might have. You can have more options maybe than are allowed, but at least it gets the discussion going. So, Robert, I'll turn the poll to you.
Okay, thanks, Jay. Your poll has been activated, so look for that letter A on the top of the participant box. If you hover over the A, you can select your answer. For those of you that came in later, and select the answer that you think. Which of the following ways: oral language, written language, pictographic, graphs, equations, mathematic, or if there's other ones, type those in the chat. Kathy's taking the let's use them all option there in the chat there. So, but I would be interesting to know the most common way. I may be modifying what your intentions are, Jay, but that's what I'd be curious about, and why is it that you don't use other ones? So, but all in the discussion. So I will let you pick and choose for a couple more seconds. Going once, twice, 3 times. I'll give you a couple more seconds. And let's post these on the whiteboard. So it looks like we've got a smattering of both oral and written, with a few people choosing pictographics, but no equations. Interesting. Okay, but there are people typing in all of them in the chat. Jay, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you, Robert. That was a nice massage to the process there. Thank you for engaging with that. It is intriguing, and I encourage you to really think about this, to push your kids to represent their information in many different ways. Lori talked about the multimodal and the research that goes along with that and what we're doing here. And there would be a sense of logical following that if they can represent it in many more forms in a sense of embeddedness where it really does, they're using different forms correctly, that would indicate a deeper understanding. But to build that, how do I build a good claims and evidence using all these different forms? That takes a lot of negotiation in your mind and with others to say, does this fit? How should I best represent that? If you think about your own experience, just deciding what kind of graph to use, that decision making is a very intellectually challenging process. And as we go to the next slide, Lori, I'd ask you to engage in here from the language side again.
Oh, well, certainly. I'm looking at what Michael posted in the chat and is mentioning IT science. And I think that idea is, so I use whatever form of language or representation that makes the most sense at any given time. And I think that's the power of the language, is that oftentimes we don't know what form it will take until we're actually engaging in the learning and know, wow, I need this in a graph form, or wow, I need this in a concept map, or this might be better. I saw someone posting very much 21st century Wordles, or blog would be best here. All sorts of a variety of ways that our students can use to represent their understanding.
Thank you, Lori. And this takes us to our next poll. I'd like you to use your stamp art or clip art, stamp your answer into the ratio for what would look like for a typical classroom lesson. And I know that's unfair because what's typical, but do the best you can to say, okay, typically it'd be 40-60 or 60-30 or for what you think it might be for you. So stamp right in there in the poll, please.
Those of you that joined us later, if you're not sure, it's the last button on the toolbar there, that below the one that looks like a camera. Select from one of the tabs an icon, and then stamp it where you want to correspond. Looks like we're getting an interesting spread over here, Jay, so I'll hand it over to you when you're ready to talk about it.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, it would be fun to be able to say, well, what is typical? But if I'm introducing something, it's going to be heavier towards the teacher talk. If the kids are doing claims demos, it maybe be the 10-90. So that what is typical, but if you think about that idea of space, I think that the critical thing is, and this is the first steps to get started. If it's about negotiation, one of the first things we have to do is shut up and give the kids time and space to negotiate and get their ideas out there, and that we step either physically out of the circle and operate from behind, or at least get on the same level. That might look like where you group the students in a circle and step behind, or it might look like that you sit down in the chair. And I'm going to ask Lori to come in here too from the working with the little ones, how to structure this idea of getting students to talk more and teacher less.
Yeah, this becomes a challenge because as teachers want to move out of the discussion, there's still some, particularly in kindergarten, is just learning turn taking, instead of all talking over each other. So our teachers have used a variety of things, like from a talking stick or something, so that the kids know who's doing the turn taking, and so it doesn't always have to throw back to the teacher. It always feels like, if teachers really want to get kids to talk to each other, how do you facilitate that rather than them always waiting for you to talk and then back to it? So they've used a variety of strategies to, or to even just redirect. So Jonathan, I see you have something you want to say to Sarah. And just so they begin to learn how dialogue works. And so that can be a little challenging too, to figure out, you know, as you were saying, it really is different depending on, are we doing claims and evidence? Are students presenting their thinking? Are they coming up to the board and sharing their concept maps and the posters that they've made? So we'll see that always shifting, but we do find that we have to scaffold their understanding of how dialogue works.
And then on an older level, you might just, you know, quietly stand behind the student and say, I don't think, did you agree with what they said? And encourage them to get out there. And as they get older or as they get more engaged, you may have to spend more time refereeing. But the idea is, you know, give them that opportunity. And so if we just kind of recap, you know, what we've talked about so far, our essential ideas and how we approach this is, you know, that argument's about unsettled knowledge, the emphasis on question, claims, and evidence, and it's about negotiation, both public and private, and giving space for both those, and language is critical. And that really is at the core of the work that we've been doing. And the approach, science writing heuristic, it's a, you know, it was work out of Brian, who wasn't able to stay with us, but then, and Carolyn Keyes, that started this whole process, but it was just a tool. And it was a way to organize the process that broke away from the traditional lab write-up, and that getting locked into how scientists would actually do their publication, not necessarily their work. And it's language-based and very demanding representationally, and requires students to do both that construct and critique and private public. So it really puts them in different roles. And it is a culture that you have to build. And the idea that we mentioned earlier, the one that's safe, and Lori talked about, we negotiate ideas, not people. And it can seem very painful at first, but it's very fruitful. And this is the difference in the way they look. And this is in the book that I know we shared at the workshops, but in the traditional one you'd see, you know, your title, your purpose, your procedure, you know, data observation in here, you know, this is where your hypothesis would go. We start with the beginning question, tests, you know, and from the teacher side, not only is the test, but can I let them do it? Then their data, their claims and evidence, and then how do I compare with others? After they've gone through the process and negotiate out their claims and evidence, how do they compare with their peers, the text, the instructor? A bit of a reflection process there at the end, and how do I compare with others, and how do I compare with where I started? What's happened to me through this process? And so starting, you know, what do the kids know? And then how am I going to use this for my instruction? And how do I engage them? You already have a classroom strategy wealth that you bring to the table. How do you identify their prior knowledge? How do you, manage groups? How do you fill in the blank? What we're asking you to do is think about the approach just from an argument-based one, where you use these strategies to build around student argument, and that the focal point is to generate questions and to guide their learning. And so if you do have the books, there's a process we use called Have a Go, where you just focus on different components of argument and say, one day I'm going to come in, I'm going to play around with questions. How do I ask good questions? How do I get the students to do good questioning? And then maybe the next day you're going to, okay, kids, we're going to just do claims and evidence. Maybe you play the game of Clue, or you do the, who broke the cookie jar, however you do that in some clever way, or give them a newspaper article and have them search through. But different strategies you might use, but to get them to engage in that kind of process and give them space to negotiate. And with that, I'm going to, Lori, anything you want to add? I'm going to end we have a lot more slides, but I knew we'd have more than we get through. And the reason is you were such a great audience for engaging in the chat and driving the conversation the way it should be driven, not just from our perspective. So, Lori?
Oh, I think we should open it up for questions. And I saw a question before, but I think she's left the chat room now for more K through 2 ideas. And I don't know if this was made public, but we do have 2 books, one for elementary K through 6 teachers called Questions, Claims, and Evidence from Heinemann, and then one called Negotiating Science. I believe one of those is available through NSTA, the Questions, Claims, Evidence book. Both are available from Heinemann, and that will give you more ideas. We shared a few ideas today, but there are more ideas, those have-a-go experiences, and we built the books around vignettes from teachers. So you'll see teachers actually explaining how they got this started, how they make it work in their classroom. So just so you know, a few people were asking, can I have more ideas like that cookie jar idea? There are some more ideas in that, but also, I don't know if Jay in my email is made available. If you also email us, we can send you some of those examples.
And Robert's already helping us out in the chat box. And there's another book called Voices from the Classroom.
Right.
That tells it from the teacher changing practice perspective. But yeah, it's time for questions and answers. For at least questions.
Yeah, so if people can type their questions in the chat. Oh, it looks like Palos has something, so I'll pass it back to you.
Lori?
Paulo, you know, the one that makes me think of is in the elementary classrooms we're in, we deal a lot with literature that the kids find. There's nonfiction literature and there are sources out there on the internet that aren't true or are not based on, I believe my science colleagues often say, what is the acceptable science knowledge of the time, right? With that idea that we're always pushing knowledge forward. So I think the idea of refuting evidence and falsification is part of our critique process, right? Is to understand that's based on opinion, that's not based on evidence. And I think we create that space in our classroom where the kids even know that they can question text that's written, and it's so interesting how many people think because it's on the internet it has to be true, and we have to create that culture and that experience in the classroom where we have to always be questioning that. Have they created or substantiated that with evidence, any claim that they're making? Jay?
And I would follow that up with, from experience with upper elementary, watching them engage in this process with the, quote, experts. They will very rapidly adopt the role of the scientific cynic, and we create monsters in the process that they really take this seriously. And I wouldn't add much to what Laura said, though. I think, is that helpful?
Any other questions that people have? Just please continue to type those in the chat. And I have a question though for either of you. Really, you were talking about applying existing strategies in new ways. I mean, is there, if you're kind of just dipping your toes into this, and because I mean, it is a big shift. And it's the kind of thing that once you start getting used to it, it makes it much easier. But what's an approach or a way that you can feel like you're making a good step? Is there anything in that regard of people what kind of recommendations you give for people that are just trying this out for the first time?
Yeah, that's a good question, Robert. I think the first thing I would say to that is that when we work with teachers, we put this out there as an approach, not a strategy. It's an approach that's student-centered, and it's an approach that's argument-based. And then all the strategies you already use, you have to make professional decisions where those would be applicable or not. And I'm going to speak, and Laura can chime in after this from the elementary perspective, because I've been spending a lot of time in their classrooms lately. But the idea of they have a wealth of strategies around reading and writing and the numeracy, and those strategies can be very effective at certain times in the approach, but it's knowing when to apply them. I like to think of it as, a bit of a diagnostician. It's a physician model, a bit of a physician model where you have to make constant assessments and decide what's the next treatment I'm going to apply. Do the students have a grasp of the concept, or do they not have a grasp of the concept? Then what do I do next? For what that dipping your toe in, I think, I would go back to the idea that we just get the kids start using the language of claims and evidence and having them build that culture where they feel comfortable to challenge and critique. And that's very difficult. The popular student gets up, gives their claims and evidence. Oh, I like them, so I agree. And that can be very difficult, where you really build a culture of challenging ideas. And that's where the strategies might come in. And you maybe use a gallery walk with Post-it notes and say, okay, what's the one question you would ask this? And have them walk around and give that set of questions. And then as the authors of that material, you can say, well, this question was helpful, this one wasn't. And you actually are educating them in the process of the critiquer in the role. Roy, what would you add?
Lori, do you have your mic on? I'm not sure if you're talking or if there's an audio issue. So.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't click the button. Sorry.
I know. It happens. Believe me, I've even done it.
And I just gave a great answer, too, and I didn't have the button on. But what I was saying is that we asked teachers that very question who were part of our projects, and they say, like Jay said, you start with claims and evidence tomorrow. When we give presentations at conferences, we'll go, that's something you can start to do tomorrow, is use claims and evidence. And then I'm going to invoke our friend Brian Hand, who's not here tonight, and he has Australian accent. He's from Australia, and he likes to say, we just have to shut our gob and get out of the way of learning. And it's like, he said, we've got to get kids to talk to each other and not only have them talk to the teacher. So he's like, we've got to take that where we pull ourselves out of the conversation and do those kind of things like, okay, Robert, I heard you say this. Who has something to say back to Robert? And again, for them to say, you're not going to answer that. I'm not going to say good answer as the teacher. I'm going to get you to start talking to each other. And I think I see where Kathy asked the question, how do you really build a culture of argument? What does that look like? What does it sound like? And I think it starts there by the teacher demonstrating and using those terms, but also creating that space where I'm not the end-all be-all, the person who always comments on what everyone says. I'm going to get you to start talking to each other and thinking about that. And then the last one I put down is a lot of teachers will say, I just have to learn to not answer their questions. So when the students come and say, well, what do you think about Pluto being demoted? You say, I don't know. What do you think? Why don't you ask the other people in the class and see what they think, so that they don't always see that the teacher has all the answers, but it also shows them that it's out here in the classroom. And I think that helps to create that culture of argument and how we begin to build questions, claims, evidence. Jay, do you have anything to add to that culture of argument?
Yeah, a couple things, and I'd follow right up with that. When you're building that culture and trying to get them to talk to each other, when they come to you with a question, say, well, I know this group over here is working on that. Can you go talk to them and see what they think? And you're always pointing them to each other, at the same time always listening. And one of the things that we always talk about in this culture of argument is, that we're arguing ideas, not people. So there's some refereeing going on. But with that in mind, that you turn everything into claims and evidence that you can in your own conversations. And when a student comes in and says, well, I think we should get out early today. Well, what's your evidence for the claim that we should get out early? I think we need to, I don't think we should have homework tonight. And so you build that in a whimsical sense, aside from just the heavy science process or whatever academic content you're focusing on. There's this whimsy to it. It becomes fun and it becomes very engaging. And the students can pick up on it very radically. But the challenge is we're asking you to, we're asking you to change the game a bit and go from a memory game to a learning game where it's not about the right answer, it's about the process. And there's going to take some time to get them to understand that it's about their claims and evidence, and that another follow-up with Lori, that the way we respond to them is critical. So every response has to be one of challenge, not one of confirmation. So we always keep them in doubt about their own claims to them, so they're always negotiating not only with the ones around them, but with themselves about, am I really that confident in my answer?
Thanks. It's really helpful. I, in my process of doing teacher workshops, have thought about these kinds of things, and just doing those little shifts have really fostered better discussion, even among teachers, adults. So I'd like to open it up. We just have a few more minutes for any other questions. So please type those in as we're ending this session. Just to give our presenters just a final word while those questions come in, I'll just hand it over to you, Jay, if you want to wrap us up.
Thank you, Robert. And I would add to Kathy's, what's it look like, what's it sound like, and what's it taste like. One of the keynote we had down in Atlanta for opening up our sessions on this strand of PD was talking about how some words just taste good. Lori and I, besides being colleagues in this SWH process, we're number nerds. We just celebrated 12-12-12-12-12. But also we are word tasters. And one of my favorite words is succulent. And if you think about words and messing around with language, some words just feel good coming out of your mouth. They have a three-dimensional taste to them. And I think that's fun to just start thinking about playing with language and the ways we use it. And it really, for me, it opened up a whole new vista professionally. So we'd encourage you to really think about that. And I'm going to, Pilsner, thank you, Czechoslovakia.
Hey, Jay, on that note, Carrie brings up a good question here. She says, I feel like I use too much of a traditional approach. What book can you recommend to help me transition to a less teacher-centered traditional approach, and I'm assuming to a more student-centered one?
And Carrie, what grade level? I think, Carrie, I would go with the negotiating science and the voices from the classroom. I feel like I'm shilling our own books, but they're a nice way to start with that. And the first 4 chapters in the book are theory-based, and then the next part of the book is, practice. And then the voice of the classroom would let you hear the struggles for actually doing this from real teachers. That Lori and I have both been in the classroom too long to be real. So I would start there. I would thank you all for being such fantastic participants and making this a very quick session, and hopefully brought something of value to the table. And I think we're out of time, Robert.
Yeah, I think we are. Lori, if you we can give you the final word. We have just a couple more minutes. So Lori, go ahead and we'll close the session.
That's the way it always is. She always gets the last word.
See, I already had that figured out. Go ahead, Lori.
And Jay took my thunder. I brought him over to thinking about the wonder of words, and he's saying such fantastic things. So I should let him have the last word. But one thing to tell you is that very powerful has been teachers through this process. And just the other day I got a letter from someone who, she's in her 2nd year of implementing the SWH and argument-based inquiry. And she said, I remember now why I love teaching. And she's like a 15-year teacher. And she just said, it's just exciting to see when the kids take control of that and the discussions that are happening. So if I could send her words back to you. Teaching in an argument-based inquiry classroom, it's just an exciting way to go about teaching and to experience learning in the classroom. Thank you to everyone for engaging tonight. Oh, and Jay wants me to say my word. My word is outstanding. I love that word.
And that's a good word to end on, an outstanding session, a succulent outstanding session. Oh, we're being recorded, so I better stop there. Anyways, Jay, thank you so much. Lori, thank you. Brian, sorry we missed you for this session, but hopefully you'll come for future sessions. And thanks to all of you. I know this is a busy time, both professionally and personally for you all, so thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. We certainly will have an archive session for this coming up on the website, but we want to thank our sponsors for today's webinars. So our great sponsors that help to support our programs here, and all the people that help to support the operations, in particular Bryn and Jeff, who work tirelessly to provide these opportunities of professional development for educators across the country and across the world, actually. So thank you for that, Jeff and Bryn. We have some upcoming programs getting ready for Next Gen Standards, December 18th, Evaluating and Communicating Information, Engineering Design. This would be a fun one, Balloon Aerodynamics Challenge, December 19th. We'll take a break, and Jeff will actually get some sleep. Analyzing Solar Energy Graphs, My NASA Data, or data if you want that, January 8th. You can register for those even when Jeff is taking a break at the Learning Center, nsda.org/webseminars. Give us a couple days. We'll send you an email with the link to the access to the recording, a copy of the slides, and then related discussion in the community forums. In just a moment, we'll give you a URL in the chat. Take as long as you need. After you complete the evaluation, you'll receive a certificate in your library and in your records, and you'll get an NSTA Sci Guide for filling it out. And allow a couple weeks for that. I'm going to stop the recording,